Welcome to number 23 of the 30 Minutes with Servoy webinars. And today is very exciting. Today we're going to be demonstrating the web component update developed by our own Paolo. And without further ado, I will hand this over to Sean. As always, oops, sorry, I'm going to take it back from Sean. As always, if you have questions, there is a questions panel. Type your question. We'll do our best to get to those questions. And okay, now all yours, Sean.
Okay, web component update. Today's update is a brand new web component, which is a powerful grid that, among many other features, supports grouping. So I'm pretty excited because my colleague Paolo, the component man, did most of the work for this webinar, but I get to have the fun and show it off to you all. Just a reminder, we do this webinar every 2 weeks. Well, sometime we took a small break last week because many of us at Servoy were doing some traveling. So, but we're back on schedule with webinar 23. We're going to keep going every 2 weeks, giving you a variety of topics and updates and best practices and that sort of thing. Today's agenda, we're going to always start with a demo of this component. Then we'll talk about how it works in developer, and then we'll do just a quick overview of everything that we just saw. So let's jump right into the component demo. I am showing you an example that's running off a cloud server here. You can see that there's a grid in the middle of the screen. It looks just like a regular basic grid. To start with, you can see that it has features like click sorting. If I do a shift click here, I get multi-column sorting. You can see that it's sorted by customer and city. Columns are resizable if I can fit my mouse in there. So kind of the things that you would expect out of a full feature grid. The selected record is highlighted, and we have data binding, so you can see that the detail part of the screen above is also in sync with the selected record. But what's different about this component is that it is groupable. So if I were to sort of mouse over, let's do customer, and click the little hamburger icon there, I get the option to group by customer. Now the UI of the grid changes dramatically, and you can see that it's listing the customers in alphabetical order because it's respecting the sort here. And then as I expand, you can see that the orders are now grouped by customer. I could continue to group, let's do country before city. So I'll add country and I'll add city in there. So now you can see that we can drill in and see orders by customer, then country, then city, then the list of orders. I guess that it makes more sense that we would group by country first, because many of the orders to a single customer go to the same city and country. So we might get more interesting data if we drag over here, and I use that as an example to show the drag and drop to regroup stuff. So now you can see that I can go country, city, then customer, and I get a bit more list of customers here there. Also worth pointing out that this is an infinite scrolling grid. So the complexity of this is all handled server side, which allows us to group and show many records. So as I scroll down, say to here, and drill in and see different records in different groups, all of this can be paged in dynamically. Of course, if it's already cached in the grid, it stays there, but if I scroll to a new area of the grid that hasn't yet loaded records, or I expand a group that hasn't yet loaded, it's paging that in dynamically, and it's done on the server. So it puts a lightweight footprint in the browser in terms of loading data. So this is an example of the traditional example data, customers, orders, that kind of thing. I want to show that this also works with a large data set. So I'm switching over to a grid here which has the Dutch postal codes, and I guess they're different than the American postal codes because there's quite a lot. This table has, well, you can see it up here, a little less than 500,000 records in it. But nonetheless, we can do the grouping because, again, the data is loaded dynamically, and the complexity of this is handled server side, so it's easy to get going. So we'll start by grouping by city, and you can see that we could continue and do by address. And this responds. This is pretty responsive because those database queries are being requested dynamically, and so you can see that I got the infinite scrolling as I expand groups. I can scroll down and get more and more addresses within a city, that sort of thing. So I just wanted to show you this example to reinforce that you get the infinite scrolling, you get the dynamic data loading, and this can work well with very, very large tables. Also, it's worth pointing out that this is a completely data-bound sort of setup. So things like doing a search on a found set can also affect what's in the grid. So I'll show that by putting a string fragment in here. Since these are Dutch cities and addresses, I'll put the Dutch word dike in there, and I'm sure there's lots of streets with that name in it. So you can see that although I've done the search on the found set, the underlying grouping and such still works. So quite easily we can drop this component in on a form and just integrate it in the rest of the programming environment, doing things like filtering and searching, doing things like linking it to a selected record and showing the detail, etc. I should also point out a bit about data broadcasting. Let me come back to our orders example here. If I am completely ungrouped, you'll notice that data broadcasting works pretty much as expected. If I modify this record here and save, you could see that the country here on the selected record in the grid was also updated. However, it's worth pointing out that if I am grouped, so let's group by country, and now let me also sort by country. That makes it easier. Let me go find the USA. And you'll notice that the record selection is no longer linked up. So it's not supported to have that record selection in sync when you have groups. And you'll also notice that that the data broadcast doesn't happen automatically. So if I switch this back to Germany, that would move that record into a different group. And let me just click out to get that autosave. And so this is by design. We don't want to automatically be refreshing the grid every time we have a data broadcast event, because it may or may not affect the grid, and the user may or may not want to constantly have their grid updated, because it could be quite expensive if you're having loads of records and there's lots of changes coming in because of high concurrency. So what we've done here, and this is an implementation more outside the grid, but this is a way to show how you might handle that from a UX point of view, is that the little refresh icon here in the grid becomes enabled every time a data broadcast is received. So then the user can say, oh, okay, well, I can see that possibly I need to refresh my grid, and I can do that, and it'll reload the data back in from the server. So in that way, you can sort of have some control. Of course, you could, it's up to you, you could turn on data broadcasting and always push data changes into the grid. But it seems like that only makes sense when we're in this ungrouped state, and then it makes a lot more sense that, okay, the record that's we're looking at has been changed and we can update it. So let's jump into the developer and just talk a bit about the setup here. You can see that I have the design view of that form we were just looking at. If I wanted to get started, I would come into my palette of components here, click Add Components, and it would bring up the Web Package Manager. This is now published, available on the Web Package Manager as of 8.2.1. So if you have 8.2.1, this will show up in your Web Package Manager under AG Grid Components. You can just click and install the component into your current project. Then you will see it show up in your browser under the Web Package AG Grid Components. You grab the grouping table, drop it on the form, and then you'll notice there's a subtype here called column. So you can go and drag the columns out onto the form because each column has a different configuration. Now let's talk about the configuration of the grid itself. If I select the grid here, you'll notice that there are quite some properties over here in the properties panel. Most notably, I would say, is the found set property. So this is set up to use the form found set. It could be configured to use a related found set, a separate found set, or a named found set, which is a new feature of 8.2. So this is a lot like the other table component that you might have seen and any other of the default components in Servoy, in that it's really easy to set up data binding. We just say this is bound to the same found set that's on this form here. Some other things to note on the developer, on the properties, would be icons. So you can see that there's the expanded and contracted icons there. Those are all glyph icons, but you could make those font awesome icons or whatever you like. So you have some control over that. Also, there's like row style class data provider. So you can actually have dynamic styling on a row level. So if you wanted to have some rows have a background highlight if they were, I don't know, invoices that were overdue and you wanted to make them red or something. So that's pretty easy to do. CSS in general, what you could do is you can create a CSS file and use all of the same classes from the internal grid and customize the style completely the way you want it, but I won't get into that. There's also some events available right on the grid, so we handle the click event and the right click event. And if you look at, we'll just look at one of these, you'll notice that it passes in the found set index, the column index that was clicked, so where basically X and Y location on the grid, the record that was clicked, and a JS event to give you all the other information about the event. It's worth pointing out that when you are in a grouped state, that the found set index is -1, because it doesn't make as much sense that it could be a group header that was clicked, for example. So it doesn't make as much sense that that we handle that. But when you're in an ungrouped state, I didn't mean to say group state. When a header is clicked, found set index is -1. When a row is clicked, then we know the index in that found set, and you can determine things about the record. Maybe you want to navigate to a detail or something like that. So events are supported. Let's take a look at the columns themselves. So if I highlight one of these guys, you can see the properties here. If you've worked with the Servoy extra table component, this might look very familiar because, again, you can get into all of the same properties, style class data provider, so you can dynamically style individual cells based on their values. Pretty much, if you've used the grid component, pretty much everything that you have there. So, and you can do that for every single component and have different properties. So there's quite some control at design time. One other thing that I'd like to show you before we kind of review what we've seen is the library that this is based on. This is based on the AG Grid library. And if I go back to my browser, I wanted to show you the AG Grid demo off of their website, because what we've done is it's a really feature-rich library, and what we wanted to do is make it easy to work with. So we took sort of a subset of features, and we really wanted to focus on grouping, because we've received a lot of feedback that groupable grids would be really valuable in applications that are built by Servoy developers. But I wanted to show you the library that we've built this on, because there's a lot of other features there, and there's a lot of possibility for enhancements or other fit-for-purpose implementations based on the same library. So for example, you can see that there's multi-selection here. These are fully draggable and to be reordered. Type ahead style filters. So you can see that you could filter within the grid right there on the column header. Although this is already possible, as you saw outside the grid, it can also be shipped as a built-in experience. If I click on the menu option here, you can see that there's some other options: pinning columns, custom filters. There's even the tool panel over here that lets you really go and show and hide columns. You can see that the columns are in a kind of grouping as well. So there's a lot of features here, and it makes sense that we break this up into smaller, fit-for-purpose sort of experiences. But I just wanted to show this to you to get you kind of excited. There's also dark themes, bootstrap themes, that kind of thing. So now you could do the CSS yourself, but these are some pre-built themes that are shipped, so possibly we could enhance it with theming. But just want to show you what's available in the library that we're working with to give you the idea that, you know, there's a lot of avenues for possible extensions and enhancements to what I've shown you. All right, let's quickly go over a few slides here to summarize what we've just seen. The key features here are that, first of all, that this is a groupable grid. So we have drag and drop runtime configuration. By runtime, I mean that end users get to choose how a group can be, or how a grid can be grouped. It's data bound, so you don't have to run the queries yourself to do the grouping. You don't have to do all that. We do that for you on the back end of the component. All you have to do is say, point to this found set, and in fact, the underlying query of that found set will also drive the underlying query of the groupable grid. Because it's found set based, you can interact with it in the same way you would other found set bound objects, search, filter, you can show related found sets, that sort of thing. You can put related data providers on the grid, etc. You can even put calculations on the grid because it's found set based. Normally, if this was query based, you couldn't do in-memory stuff. The data is loaded dynamically, which means that it's very powerful. You can scale up to support very large tables, as we saw in the Dutch postal codes. There was almost 500,000 records there. And so that means you also get the infinite scrolling that you would get in something that's dynamically loaded, and infinite grouping. So, you know, if you expand a group, it's going to page in all of the subgroups or all of the records in that group dynamically as you expand it. You have full CSS control over the component, although I didn't really demonstrate how you could do that. It's possible. You just have to implement the CSS classes of the underlying library and change them however you like. There's events and API. Right now we have the 2 events for the clicking, and there's some API on doing things like refreshing the data. I left a feature in there that's something that is supposed to be in upcoming stuff, the export. That's not currently supported. That will be in possible enhancements. So we'll get back to that. There are some current limitations. We wanted to make a minimum viable product that solves a few key problems that we're hearing about and lets people get started and deliver a grouping grid experience. But we realized that to get this out quickly, there are some limitations up front. So it's good to disclose those. This is a read-only grid. This is not meant to be editable at this time. The data source is also, for various reasons, is limited to a table which has single column PKs. Now there may be some workarounds for that, but right now you have to have a one column PK to be able to work with the grouping grid. Calculations and aggregations are supported because it's found set based. However, they're not groupable because the grouping happens in a query. Therefore, it doesn't happen client-side inside the component. Therefore, grouping by a calculation, which doesn't actually exist in the database, doesn't make any sense. Same goes for Servoy aggregations. So they're supported to show in the record view. However, you can't group by them. Data broadcasting into the grid automatically is not supported when it's grouped. So we do that on purpose to limit the number of times the grid has to refresh. So you saw that the workaround sort of for that, or an alternate experience that you can provide, is to catch the data broadcast and then tell the grid to change the style of the little refresh button so that the user gets the indication that, hey, maybe you want to refresh the grid at some point. One issue that we have to work out is that it's not yet fully persistent between form shows. So if I navigate away from the grid and I come back, it doesn't leave me in the same exact setup that I had. The grouping stays the same. However, where I've expanded and what I've scrolled to doesn't. That's a bit tricky, and we're working on that. I also want to point out that summarizing in the grid is not supported. I think some people would assume that if I can see it by groups, then I want to see summarized data in the groups. That's another use case, which would be more like a pivot grid, and we have some things in the works for that as well. So I just want to point out that this is for really viewing data, not for viewing and analyzing trends. So possible extensions that we can do based on this library to this component, or additionally other components. Draggable column reorders should be possible. Runtime column configuration, so being able to say, have a chooser and say, I want these fields, I want to hide this field, that sort of thing. Type ahead filtering built into the column headers, so that I could just quickly type a few keystrokes and see the grid winnow down the results. Custom built-in filters, being able to have that filter drop down that you saw in the AG grid demo, and give it some customized filter parameters. So maybe I show the list of the customers, and I can go and check off what customers I'm showing. That should be easy to do. Themes that are built in, so being able to make the theming of the component easier out of the box. As I said before, you have full control via CSS, but it might be easier to get a few pre-built themes in there that you can work with. Multi-select support. Right now, when we're in the ungrouped mode, the record selection is in sync with the found set. However, we're not supporting a multi-select found set. And then something which would be cool, I think, would be a master detail experience. So if you were to expand a group, instead of seeing the row in there, you could see a form that's reusable. So when I get down to the actual record view of inside a group, instead of seeing a row, I might see a detail form that has some other components in it other than just a row. It's also worth pointing out that this library is very rich and has a lot of features. So we may not deliver all of this in one super component. It may make sense to have a separate grid that's editable, a rich grid versus a lightweight grid, and maybe a pivot grid as well. A little bit about the licensing. So this is a partnership between the AG Grid vendor and Servoy. We have an OEM with them, so we are licensed to distribute this component. The license for the Servoy component falls under the MIT license, which is a very permissive license that we use for all of the other components that we put up on GitHub. This gives you unlimited deployment, so you can take this component, put it on your form, and deploy it without any worries, which is great for you. However, I just want to point out that the AG Grid is a proprietary library, and so the sources that are used by the component are not subject to the same rights. If you want to modify those sources, if you wanted to distribute those sources yourself or create your own custom implementation using those, you must purchase a developer license from AG Grid. The component that we distribute does not authorize you to do those things. All right, now that I've covered myself legally, how do you get started with the grid? As I showed, it's very easy. You import the Web Package Manager. You can download the sample solution that I was just showing you. The wiki docs are available on the project site, which is up here on GitHub. And you can see that there's some nice documentation for your pleasure reading there. And of course, if you have issues or enhancement requests, there is an issue tracker on every GitHub project. So we encourage you to use that. We're just about out of time, so I'm going to put up the useful links slide so you guys can stare at that while Steve tells me if we had any questions.
We did. There's a couple, some of them have already been answered. There was a couple of questions about can you use aggregates and summary data and things like that in the groups or in the group headers? And I think that you already answered that question.
Right, right.
There is a question about, is there a double-click event?
There is not a double-click event.
Okay.
Right now there's right-click and single-click.
Okay. And another question, does drag to group work, or is it done only through the group button? I think it refers to specifying the groups. You showed it by clicking the little icon in the header. Can you drag one header on top of another header or something to do the group?
The short answer is not. Right now, you can't just drag a column into the grouping area. The long answer is that it is possible. So we can look into supporting that. Right now, the way you get to the grouping is to click the little hamburger icon and say add to group. But certainly, it's a nicer user experience if you could just click once and drag, and that should be possible.